He showed up expecting a quiet dinner. What he didn't know was that four of his closest friends were already seated across the room, watching, waiting to see how he'd react when he discovered the woman they'd set him up with used a wheelchair. They wanted to know what kind of man Wyatt Grayson really was. What they didn't plan for was Avery Sterling. They didn't plan for the way she'd already clocked every single one of them from the moment she rolled through that door. And they definitely didn't plan for what Wyatt would do next, something so quietly decent it would change the entire direction of both their lives. If you want to know what real strength looks like, not the loud kind, but the kind that shows up without an audience, stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see just how far this story travels. The reservation was under Marcus's name, which should have been Wyatt's first warning. Marcus didn't make reservations. Marcus showed up places and charmed his way into corners, talked bartenders into giving him tables that weren't available, and once convinced a hostess at a packed steakhouse to let him eat at the bar by complimenting her earrings for 4 straight minutes. Marcus was not a man who planned ahead. So when Wyatt got the text, "Table's already set, 7 o'clock, Collier's on 5th, don't be late," he stood in his kitchen staring at it with the particular exhaustion of a man who already knew something was being arranged around him. He texted back, "What is this?" Marcus replied immediately, "Dinner." "With who?" "People." Wyatt set the phone face down on the counter. Across the kitchen, his daughter Lily was sitting at the table with a plate of cut apple slices and a worksheet she was supposed to be finishing before bed. She was 7, and she had her mother's focused frown, the one that looked like concentration but usually meant she was buying time. "You're making that face," she said, without looking up. "What face?" "The Marcus face." She wrote something, erased it. "He wants you to do something." "He wants me to have dinner." "With who?" He said people. Lily looked up then, and the expression she gave him, patient, slightly disappointed, thoroughly unimpressed, was so far beyond her 7 years that Wyatt had to look away. She got that from him. He knew it. She'd inherited his habit of seeing through things. "You should go," she said. "Mrs. Tran already said she'd stay late." "I didn't ask Mrs. Tran." "I did." He stared at her. She went back to her worksheet. This was the thing about raising a kid alone. At some point, they started raising you back. And the shift happened so gradually, you didn't notice until your 7-year-old was coordinating your social calendar with your elderly neighbor. He almost canceled twice on the drive over. The first time was at a red light on Delancey, when he caught his own reflection in the dark window of the car next to him and thought, with some clarity, that he looked like a man who had not slept a full night in 3 years, which was accurate. He had not slept a full night in 3 years. He ran a hand through his hair and it stayed exactly where he'd pushed it, which was not a good sign. The second time was when he pulled into the parking structure on 5th and sat for a moment with the engine idling and thought about how the last time Marcus had set him up with someone, it had ended with the woman leaving mid-appetizer because she'd gotten a call from someone who was, apparently, more important than a first date. Wyatt had sat alone with 2 glasses of wine and a breadbasket and flagged the waiter for the check with a specific kind of hollow dignity he hadn't enjoyed repeating. He turned the engine off. He got out. Collier's was the kind of restaurant that existed in a specific tax bracket. Not so formal that you felt underdressed in a button-down, but expensive enough that the menu didn't have prices. Wyatt was in dark slacks and a gray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He'd changed 3 times at the house before Lily pointed at the gray shirt and said that one without looking up from her book. And he decided not to argue. The hostess smiled at him. "Name?" "Wyatt Grayson. Reservation might be under Marcus Webb." She scanned her tablet, nodded. "Right this way?" He followed her through the main dining room, and he was looking for Marcus, for the familiar wide shoulders and the loud laugh and the general chaos that accompanied Marcus Webb wherever he went. When he saw the table, 4 people, Marcus, and then Danny, Marcus's girlfriend, who was leaning forward with her chin in her hand, and then Reed, who Wyatt had known since college, sitting with his arms crossed and his jaw working slightly the way it did when he was paying close attention to something. And then Priya, Reed's wife, who was the sharpest person Wyatt had ever met, and who was currently not looking at the door at all, which meant she absolutely knew he'd just walked in. They were all looking at something. No, someone. Wyatt followed their line of sight. She was seated at the far end of the table, slightly apart from the group, and she was in a wheelchair. She had dark hair pulled back in a way that looked deliberate rather than rushed, and she was wearing a deep green blazer over a black top, and she was not looking at the group that was very obviously watching her. She was looking at her menu, or she'd been looking at her menu, because in the time it took Wyatt to process what he was seeing, she looked up, directly at him, with the particular expression of someone who had been monitoring their surroundings the entire time, and had simply chosen not to show it. She had dark eyes. They were not warm at this exact moment. They were assessing. He became aware, with a slow dropping sensation in his stomach, of several things simultaneously. This was the blind date. His friends had arranged this, and they were watching. They were watching her. He didn't move for a moment. The hostess beside him said something he didn't catch, and he said thank you on reflex, and then stood very still in the middle of a moving restaurant and thought about what his friends were doing. Not just setting him up, testing him, testing how he'd react to her. The anger arrived quietly, not hot, just there, like a hand on his shoulder. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at any of them. He walked toward the table, but not toward the group end of it, and he crouched down slightly so he wasn't looming and said to her, "Hey, I'm Wyatt." Up close, she looked even more self-possessed. She had the kind of stillness that wasn't passive. It was deliberate, like someone who'd made a decision years ago to take up exactly as much space as she wanted, and not apologize for any of it. She said, "I know." Her voice was dry. "They showed me a photo. Did they tell you they were going to sit there and watch us?" Something moved across her face. Not surprised, she'd already worked it out, but something that looked briefly like relief that he'd named it first. "Not in so many words," she said. He straightened. He looked at the table, at Marcus, who had gone a little still, and Danny, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, and Reed, who met his eyes and then looked away, and Priya, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Then he looked back at her. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and you can absolutely say no, and I'll just sit down over there and we can all have dinner together, and it'll be fine." She waited. "Do you want to move to a different table?" She looked at him for a moment, a real look, not the defensive kind she'd been using on his friends. This one was trying to figure out who he was. "Yes," she said. The hostess found them a table near the window, away from the main floor traffic, and gave no indication that it was unusual to seat two people separately from the reservation they'd arrived with. Wyatt held the table steady while Avery positioned herself. She didn't need his help, and he didn't offer it, just stood nearby in case the table shifted. And then he sat down across from her and picked up his menu. Avery Sterling, he'd learn later, had a company worth more than most regional banks, and had been named one of the 40 most influential technology executives in the country. But right now she was looking at the pasta section with a slight frown that suggested she was deciding whether the truffle linguine was worth the price. "They're going to be annoyed," she said. "Probably. Marcus looked annoyed when we moved. He'll get over it." He paused. "Did he tell you much about me?" "He said you were a good guy." Her tone was scrupulously neutral, like she was reporting a fact and reserving all judgment until she had more data. "He said you were an engineer, civil. He said you had a daughter." A beat. "He didn't say her name." "Lily. She's 7. Something changed in her expression, just almost imperceptible, but there. "How long have you been doing it alone?" 3 years. She was 4 when her mom left." He said it without particular weight. It was just true. He'd had a long time to get the emotion out of the saying of it. It was mutual mostly, or it became mutual. "She's in Portland now. She visits." Avery nodded. She didn't say "I'm sorry" or "that must be hard," which he appreciated. She just absorbed the information. "What did they tell you about me?" she asked. "Nothing." She looked up from the menu. "They told me I was meeting someone," he said. "They said she was remarkable. That's the exact word Marcus used. Remarkable." He paused. "I thought he was overselling. And now?" He considered that. "I think he might have undersold it, actually." She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her face said she was deciding whether that was a line. He let her decide. It wasn't. Avery Sterling, she said, and extended her hand across the table. Wyatt Grayson. He shook it. Her grip was firm, and she didn't hold it a beat longer than necessary. So, she said, you're a civil engineer. Bridges mostly, infrastructure assessment. I spend most of my professional life telling people that things are more structurally compromised than they'd like to believe. That sounds exhausting. It is. He turned a page of the menu without reading it. You're a CEO. Of a technology company, yes. We build accessibility and adaptive interface software. She said it the way people said things they believed in, without performance, just matter of fact. I started it 6 years ago. From scratch? From a hospital room, technically. She said it without drama. I had some time on my hands. He looked at her. She met his look without flinching. The accident, he said. She picked up her water glass. Spinal cord injury. Incomplete, which means the damage wasn't total, which means I have some function below the injury site. I can stand, briefly, with support. I prefer the chair. She set her glass down. I say that for context, not for sympathy. I stopped wanting sympathy approximately 4 months after the accident. Noted. Most people have a follow-up question, she said. The same one, usually. What happened? Yes. I don't have that question. She studied him again with that careful, measuring look. Why not? Because you'll tell me if you want to. He glanced at the menu again. Are you getting the linguine? She blinked, then very slowly, a small smile. I'm considering it. I'm going to get the steak. I'm aware that's uncreative. Steak in a restaurant like this is not uncreative, she said. It's strategic. But they stayed at that table for 2.5 hours. Not because the food took that long. Because they kept talking, and the conversation had the quality of something that didn't want to stop. Not forced, not performed, but like two people who had each spent a long time talking to people who didn't quite keep up, and had grown tired of slowing down. Avery was sharp in the way that people who'd had to rebuild things from the ground up tended to be sharp. There was no theoretical softness in her thinking, no comfortable assumptions. She'd had to test every belief she'd had about herself, and the ones that survived were the ones that had actual foundations. Wyatt was quiet in the way people were quiet when they'd learned that saying less was more useful. He asked good questions. He listened to the whole answer. He didn't redirect things back to himself. At some point, the waiter cleared their plates, and neither of them ordered dessert, and neither of them moved. You never tried to explain them, Avery said. She meant his friends. I can't explain them, Wyatt said. I can apologize for them. I'm sorry they did that. I'm not sure you're the one who owes me an apology. Maybe not, but someone should give you one, and they're over there eating tiramisu and pretending not to look over here, so I'll go first. She glanced across the restaurant at the other table. Marcus and Danny and Reed and Priya were, in fact, very deliberately not looking. It was the most conspicuous not looking Wyatt had ever witnessed. They thought they were doing something kind, Avery said. She didn't say it warmly, but she also wasn't wrong. They were trying to test my reaction, Wyatt said. To me, to... She gestured, a small economical gesture toward the chair, and he nodded. Yes. And what was your reaction? He thought about how to answer that. Honest answer? Please. My reaction was that I was angry, not at you, at the situation, at the idea that you were sitting there being watched while you waited for a stranger to decide how to feel about you. He paused. That felt wrong, like something I wanted to stop. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the window, the street was wet from rain that had started while they'd been inside. Most people would have just sat down and tried to be normal about it, she said. That felt worse somehow. She nodded slowly. It is worse, she said. The performance of not noticing it's exhausting. You can always tell when someone is performing. How long did you know they were watching you before I came in? About 30 seconds after I sat down. The corner of her mouth lifted. Priya's the worst at hiding it. She kept angling her water glass. Wyatt laughed. A real one, startled out of him. Avery's smile widened a fraction. She's actually the sharpest person I know, he said. I believe it, which is why she should know better than to angle her water glass. They were the last people in their section of the restaurant. The waiter had come by twice with the expression of a man too professional to say anything but hoping to convey that his shift had technical limitations. Wyatt paid without making a production of it. Avery didn't protest and didn't thank him excessively. She just said, "Next one's on me," which meant she was thinking about a next one, which he noticed. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sidewalk was still wet, lit up under the restaurant's awning lights. Marcus materialized approximately 12 seconds after they stepped outside, which meant he'd been watching the door. "Hey," he said to both of them, with the energy of a man trying to figure out the temperature of a room before he committed to a facial expression. "Hey, Marcus," Avery said. "So, how was—" "You staged it," Wyatt said. "You sat there and watched." Marcus had the decency to look like a man who knew he'd miscalculated. "We weren't trying to—" "You were testing me," Wyatt said. "Which I get. That's fine. That part I can understand." He kept his voice even. "But you were also testing her, and she didn't sign up for that part." Marcus opened his mouth. Avery said, "He's right." Marcus closed his mouth. "I'm not angry," Avery said. "I want to be clear about that. I understand what you were trying to do, but I'm not a situation for you to manage. I'm not a test you run on your friends." She said it without heat, in the same tone she'd used to describe her injury. Just factual, just true. "Next time, ask me first." There was a silence. Danny, who had appeared behind Marcus, nodded once with the expression of someone who thought this was deserved. "Yeah," Marcus said. "You're right. I'm sorry." Avery nodded, accepting it. Reed and Priya had joined them on the sidewalk, and Reed said something to Wyatt, low, and Wyatt shook his head, not unkindly. But everyone said their goodbyes in pieces. That dispersal that happens outside restaurants when the night has gone on long enough and the cold is starting to remind people they have beds. Wyatt and Avery ended up standing under the awning together, which hadn't been planned. He was waiting for a gap in the foot traffic to get to the parking structure. And she was waiting for something too, though he didn't ask what. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Do you actually want to do this again? Not—" She paused, choosing carefully. "Not as a thing you're being kind about, actually." He looked at her. She was watching him with the same measuring look, but this one was different, not protective, just honest. She wanted a real answer. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because you told me to note that you don't want sympathy within the first 10 minutes of meeting you, and I thought that was one of the most useful things anyone had ever said to me on a first date." She looked at him for a moment. "That's specific. I tend to be specific. Engineers." "Exactly." She pulled out her phone. "Your number." He gave it to her. She typed it in and sent him a text so he'd have hers. The message said only Avery Sterling, in case you forgot. He looked down at his phone and then up at her. "I wasn't going to forget," he said. "I know," she said, "but I like being explicit about things." He smiled. She smiled back. A real one this time, the kind that reached things. "Good night, Wyatt Grayson." "Good night, Avery Sterling." He walked toward the parking structure. Halfway down the block, he glanced back. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't something he typically did. And she was still under the awning, her phone in her hand, and she was looking in his direction. He didn't wave. She didn't wave. It wasn't that kind of moment. He turned the corner and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he'd been existing inside his own life for 3 years like a man in a holding pattern, doing everything right, handling everything, keeping everything running. And for the first time in a long time, something had happened that he hadn't planned for and didn't want to plan for. He'd wanted to get home to Lily. He still did. But he also, for the first time in 3 years, thought about tomorrow. Lily was asleep when he got in, as expected. Mrs. Tran was in the armchair with her knitting and a news program she watched at a volume Wyatt had always thought was for a woman with significant hearing loss, until he realized she simply felt that news should be heard. She waited up until 9:15, Mrs. Tran said, standing and folding her knitting with practiced efficiency. Then she gave up. "I should have been back by 9. "You weren't, though." She said it without judgment, just observation, and picked up her bag. Good dinner? Different, he said. Mrs. Tran considered this with the serenity of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by the things that turned out to matter. That's usually better than good. She let herself out. Wyatt stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, poured a glass of water, stood at the counter and thought, without trying to make it mean more than it did, about a woman with dark eyes and a blazer the color of deep water who had said, "I like being explicit about things," and handed him a business card's worth of herself without flinching. Then he went down the hall and pushed Lily's door open, quietly, the way he'd done every night for 3 years. She was curled on her side, one arm hooked around her stuffed penguin, hair across her face the way it always was. He reached in and tucked it back behind her ear without waking her. She muttered something that might have been his name. "Yeah," he said. "I'm home." She didn't answer. He pulled the door to, leaving it half open the way she liked, and went to bed. His phone lit up on the nightstand. He looked at it. The text was from Avery Sterling's number. It said, "The truffle linguine was worth it, for the record." He looked at it for a moment. Then he typed back, "I had steak. 0 regrets." 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, "Predictable." Then, after a pause, "I meant that as a compliment." He set the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought that the night had been, in the end, nothing like what he'd expected. Which was, he was starting to think, exactly the point. The second date wasn't planned the way the first one hadn't been planned. Which is to say, it happened the way things happen when two people are pretending to themselves that they're being casual about something that is not casual at all. Wyatt texted her on a Tuesday. It took him longer than it should have to write something that said, essentially, "Do you want to get coffee?" because he kept writing it and deleting it and writing it again. And eventually Lily walked past the kitchen table, glanced at his phone, and said, "Just send it," without breaking stride toward the refrigerator. He sent it. Avery replied in 4 minutes. "Saturday morning works. You pick the place, somewhere with actual parking and not a line out the door." He picked a place on Marsh Street, a coffee shop that had been there since before the neighborhood got expensive and had survived by being genuinely good rather than aesthetically interesting. No exposed pipes, no reclaimed wood, no menu written on a chalkboard in someone's idea of artisanal handwriting. Just good coffee and tables that weren't cramped and a side entrance with a ramp that worked, which he'd checked on the Maps app and then felt strange about checking and then decided it was just practical and stopped feeling strange about it. She arrived 3 minutes after he did, which he noticed and which he suspected was not an accident. She was in a dark jacket and jeans, and her hair was down this time. Not the deliberate pulled-back arrangement from the restaurant, just her hair, which was dark and slightly wavy and not fully cooperating with the morning. "You found it," he said. "I have GPS." She looked at the place with the expression of someone doing a quick structural assessment. "This is a real coffee shop." As opposed to, the kind that exists to be photographed. She wheeled past him to the counter. "I appreciate this." They ordered. She paid before he got his wallet out, not quickly, just decisively, like someone who'd made the decision before she'd walked in. He thought about saying something and decided not to. They took the corner table by the window because it had the most room, and because the light was good, and because without either of them naming it, they'd both angled toward the place that offered the clearest view of the door. Wyatt noticed that and thought it said something about both of them that he wasn't sure he could articulate yet. "How was your week?" she asked. "Long. We're doing a structural review on a bridge out past the county line. Built in the 80s, nobody's done a proper assessment in 11 years. Every day I go out there, I find something new to be quietly horrified by. And nobody wants to hear it. The county project manager told me with a straight face that the bridge has been there for 40 years and it's fine." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "I told him the Titanic had been in the water for 2 hours and was also fine." Avery made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a verdict. "How did that go?" He didn't laugh. "I'm laughing. I can tell. You do this thing where you almost laugh and then you pull it back like you're deciding whether I've earned it yet." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "That's observant." "I told you, structural assessment. I look at things." She set her cup down. "Okay. Yes, I do that." She said it without apology. I've been in enough rooms where people decided my reaction meant something about me, whether I was too serious, too guarded, too cold, so I got careful about what I gave away early. That makes sense. It's also a habit I don't always need anymore and haven't fully broken. He nodded. Outside, a bus went past and rattled the window slightly. She didn't flinch. "What's Lily doing today?" she asked. "Soccer practice until noon. Then she's at my sister's." He paused. "She asked about you." Avery raised her eyebrows. "She said Marcus mentioned there was someone. She wanted to know your name." "What did you tell her?" "I told her your name. I told her you ran a company." He thought about it. "She asked what kind. I said software. She said that was cool and went back to her book." High praise from a 7-year-old. "You have no idea. Last week she told me my cooking was adequate. She's brutal." Avery's mouth curved. This time she let it. "Okay." The coffee stretched to an hour and a half, and then she mentioned she had a call at noon and he said he had to pick up Lily, and they were both telling the truth, but there was a moment outside on the sidewalk where neither of them moved immediately toward their respective cars. "I should tell you something," Avery said. He waited. "I'm not easy to date. I'm not saying that as a warning exactly, more as..." She paused, picking the word disclosure. "Okay. I work a lot. I have opinions about almost everything and I don't always soften them. I have a physical reality that adds logistics to things that other people take for granted. And I've been with people who said it didn't matter to them, and then it started mattering, and they didn't know how to tell me." She said all of this levelly, not like she was reading from a list, but like she'd learned through repetition which things needed to be said early. "I'm not interested in someone performing patience they don't actually have." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Most people say it doesn't matter." "I know. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm saying I appreciate that you told me." He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "For what it's worth, I have a 7-year-old who has night terrors twice a month and gets sick every time the weather changes. I run on interrupted sleep and cold coffee, and the particular kind of mental math you do when you're always figuring out childcare logistics 3 days in advance." He looked at her. "I'm not easy either." She held his gaze. "No," she said after a moment. "I didn't think you were." They went out 4 more times over the following 6 weeks. Not fast, not slow. Just regularly. A dinner on a Wednesday when Lily was at her aunt's. A Sunday afternoon walk along the waterfront, which required some rerouting when they hit a stretch of uneven pavement, and which neither of them commented on, except when Avery said flatly, "This city's sidewalks are a liability lawsuit waiting to happen." And Wyatt said, "I know. I've written 3 reports about this exact stretch." And she looked at him and said, "You're kidding." And he said, "Infrastructure assessment covers more than bridges." And she said, "I want to read those reports." And he said, "They're extremely dry." And she said, "I run a technology company. I read regulatory compliance documents for fun." They were, both of them, trying to be careful. That was the honest way to say it. Not because they didn't feel something. The feeling was the point. The feeling was the reason for the carefulness. But because they'd each learned, separately and through different damage, that moving quickly without looking was how you ended up somewhere you hadn't meant to go. Wyatt had not been in a relationship since Lily's mother. Not a real one. He'd been on dates, 4, maybe 5, over 3 years. All of them fine and none of them making him feel any particular urgency to call back. He told himself he was protecting Lily from disruption, and that was true. But it was also true that he'd been protecting himself from having to try again, and he knew the difference. Avery had been in one relationship since her accident. It had lasted 8 months and ended when the man she was seeing, kind, genuinely kind, the kind of kind that still managed to be insufficient, told her that he sometimes felt out of his depth with her life, and she'd understood immediately that out of his depth meant tired, and had ended it herself before he could work up to it. She hadn't dated since. That had been 2 years ago, so they were careful. They were careful, and they were also, increasingly, something that careful couldn't quite contain. The thing that broke the carefulness, or started to, was not a grand moment. It was a Thursday evening, unexpected, when Wyatt's sister had to cancel last minute and Lily's school had a half day, and the logistics of his afternoon collapsed in the specific cascading way that solo parent logistics sometimes did. He texted Avery to cancel their plans, explained the situation, said he was sorry. She texted back, "I could come to you if that works. I haven't met Lily yet. If it's too soon, say so. No pressure." He looked at the text for a long moment. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table with a drawing she was working on. One of her elaborate ones, full of tiny details, the kind that took hours. He texted back, "Let me ask her." He walked into the kitchen. "Hey, remember the woman I told you about? Avery?" Lily kept drawing. "The one who runs the software company." "Yeah, she was going to come over anyway, but I was going to cancel since you're home. I wanted to ask you first." Lily was quiet for a moment, adding a small detail to the corner of her drawing. "Does she like kids?" "I don't actually know. You should find out." She looked up. "She can come." He texted Avery. "She said yes. Fair warning, she will probably have opinions." Avery arrived 45 minutes later and Lily answered the door because she'd heard the car and gotten there first, and she stood in the doorway and looked at Avery with the full, frank assessment of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't evaluating someone. "Hi," Lily said. "Hi," Avery said. "I'm Avery." "I know. I'm Lily." She stepped back to let Avery through. "Do you want to see what I'm drawing?" Avery looked at her. "Yes, actually." They spent 40 minutes at the kitchen table. Wyatt made dinner and watched from the stove as Avery leaned over to look at the drawing and ask questions. Not the performed enthusiasm kind of questions adults ask kids, but real ones, like she actually wanted to understand what the drawing was about. Lily explained at length. She gesticulated. She picked up her pencil and added things to illustrate her explanations. At one point, she looked up at Avery and said, "You ask good questions," with the bluntness of a person whose compliments were not inflated. Avery said, "You give good answers." Wyatt put pasta on the table, and the three of them ate, and the conversation was odd and uneven the way dinner with a 7-year-old always was, lurching from topic to topic, interrupted by announcements about facts Lily had recently learned, undercut by an argument about whether mushrooms were a legitimate food. Avery took Lily's side on the mushrooms, which Wyatt thought was a strategic betrayal. "They're a fungus," Lily said triumphantly. "She's right," Avery said. "You're both wrong," Wyatt said. "They're delicious." Lily made a face. Avery made roughly the same face. They both looked at him. He pointed his fork at both of them. "This is a conspiracy." Lily laughed. It was the loose, unself-conscious laugh of a kid who'd been at ease. Not performing ease, just actually there. After dinner, Lily disappeared to her room with her drawing, and Avery helped clear the table without asking, and Wyatt washed, and she stacked, and it was quiet in the way that comfortable quiet was, where neither person felt the need to fill it. "She's remarkable," Avery said. "She'd probably note that that word gets overused." "She'd be right." She handed him the last plate. "She's also clearly watching everything. She's been clocking both of us all evening." "I know, she does that." "She gets it from you." He looked at her sideways. She wasn't smiling, just observing. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's reassuring, actually." Marcus called on a Friday night in week 7, which Wyatt knew meant Marcus had been waiting to see how things developed before picking up the phone. Marcus's social timing had always been impeccable in a self-serving direction. "So," Marcus said. "So," Wyatt said. "How's it?" "It's good, Marcus." A pause. "I wanted to say again about the thing at the restaurant. You already said it. Avery already said she wasn't angry. We're past it." "I know, but I wanted you to know that we weren't trying to make her feel like a test subject." Silence. "I know," Marcus said. "I know how it looked. It looked like what it was. You wanted to see how I'd handle it. Which, I get, man. You're my friend, and you were trying to look out for me. But she walked in there knowing you were watching her and waiting to see how I'd react, and she sat at that table and held it together, and that took something." His voice didn't rise. She didn't owe anyone a performance. Marcus was quiet on the other end for a beat. You're right. I know. Are you in love with her? Wyatt leaned against the kitchen counter. Lily's light was off. She'd gone to bed 20 minutes ago. The house was quiet. I don't know yet, he said. I'm in the part before that, where you're still figuring out the shape of it. That's a very civil engineer way to describe falling for someone. I'm assessing the structure, making sure the foundations are what they look like. Marcus made a sound. She's good for you. That's all I wanted to say, actually. She's remarkable, Wyatt said. Yeah, I know. The conversation with Avery's team happened by accident, which was to say, it was the result of a specific kind of accident that is really just two people's lives intersecting at a point where they hadn't fully prepared for the intersection. Wyatt had agreed to pick up Avery from her office after a late meeting ran long because her regular driver had a family emergency and she'd sent him home. He arrived at the Sterling Technologies building at 7:45 and checked in with the lobby security and took the elevator to the 11th floor. The meeting had just ended. He could tell because 4 people were standing in the hallway outside the conference room with the slightly wrung-out look of a long session winding down. And Avery was in the doorway saying something to a woman with a laptop and a stressed expression who was writing things down very fast. Wyatt stood near the elevator and waited. One of the 4 people, a man in his 30s with the practiced ease of someone senior enough to be relaxed, glanced at him and then glanced again. You're here for Avery? He said. Not rude, just checking. Yeah, she mentioned her driver. Right. The man extended his hand. James Cho. I'm her VP of product. Wyatt Grayson. James Cho had the look of someone processing information quickly. The engineer. That's me. James said nothing for a moment, and then said carefully, She doesn't usually let anyone come up here. Wyatt didn't know what to do with that, so he just nodded. Good, James said. I just meant, good. Avery finished with the woman, turned, and saw him. For a fraction of a second, something moved across her face. Not surprise, she'd known he was coming, but something else. Something that looked like the particular relief of seeing a face you weren't having to perform for. Ready? He said. Give me 2 minutes. She turned back. Lydia, push the vendor call to Thursday and send me the revised deck tonight, not tomorrow morning. Tonight, Lydia confirmed, still writing. And eat something. You look like you've been running on coffee since noon. Lydia looked up, momentarily surprised by the shift. I had a granola bar. That's not food. Avery turned back to Wyatt. Okay, 1 minute. She disappeared briefly to get her bag, and James Cho said quietly to Wyatt, She works too hard. I know, Wyatt said. Does she listen to you about it? Not particularly. James nodded, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. But she hears it, at least. Wyatt looked at him. Why are you asking me? James considered that. Because she's different, he said evenly. Since she started, whatever this is, she's not different at work. Same Avery at work. But there's something, like a weight that's slightly less. He paused. I've worked for her for 4 years. I notice things. Wyatt didn't answer because Avery came back with her bag and looked between them with the focused attention of a person who clocked everything. What are you two talking about? She said. Infrastructure, Wyatt said. James Cho smiled and said goodnight and walked away, and Avery looked at Wyatt with narrowed eyes that said she didn't entirely believe him. Infrastructure, she said. Broad field, he said. She looked at him a moment longer, then let it go, and they went to the elevator, and he held the door and she didn't comment on it, and he didn't make it a thing, and they went down to the lobby and out into the evening air. Long meeting? He said. They're always long. She exhaled. I sometimes think if I could get people to say exactly what they mean without performing all the preamble, I could reclaim 4 hours a week. You do that. I try to. A pause. Not everyone appreciates it. Your VP of product seems fine with it. She looked at him. What did he actually say? He said you work too hard. She was quiet. He's not wrong, Wyatt said. No, she said. He's not. She said it without defensiveness, which told him something about how much she already knew. The company is at a stage where if I take my hands off the wheel for more than 2 days, things drift. I know that. I'm working on building the kind of structure where that's not true, but I'm not there yet. What does it look like when you get there? She thought about it honestly. I don't entirely know. I haven't had a real vacation in 3 years. A beat. Have you? Define vacation. More than 2 days in a row where nobody is asking you for something. He thought about it. No. They walked. She rolled. He walked to the parking structure. And she let him load her chair into the back because the angle of the trunk latch was awkward, and she said so, and he did it without ceremony while she transferred to the passenger seat, and then they drove out of downtown and toward her building. Somewhere on the bridge over Carver Canal, she said, "I like your daughter." He kept his eyes on the road. "She likes you." "How do you know?" "She told me the next morning. She said, and I'm quoting, 'Avery is smart and she doesn't talk to me like I'm little.'" He paused. "That's about the highest rating she gives." Avery looked out the window at the water below. "When I was 7, she said, I hated when adults simplified things for me. I could tell when they were doing it, made me feel like they saw the kid first and the person second." She was quiet a moment. "I don't know if that's why I did it or just what I do. Either way." It mattered to her, he said. She didn't answer, but he saw her reflection in the passenger window, and the expression on her face was private and small and real. The conversation he'd been avoiding with himself caught up with him on a Wednesday morning, standing in line at the coffee cart outside the municipal building where he had a 9 o'clock meeting. He was thinking about her, which was not itself the revelation. He'd been thinking about her with increasing frequency for weeks. The revelation was when he caught himself thinking about her the way you thought about someone who had become load-bearing, not just present in your days, but structural to them. The way the absence of something would mean reconfiguring everything else around the gap. He thought about Lily asking if Avery was coming over again. Thought about the way Avery moved through his kitchen like she'd decided to be comfortable there. Not because she had no self-consciousness, but because she'd chosen to set it down. Thought about her in the elevator with her eyes closed for 3 seconds before the doors opened on the lobby, the only moment all evening he'd seen her actually rest. He wasn't going to say any of it yet. He knew better than to say it before it had earned the saying, but he wasn't going to pretend either, not to himself, that he was still in the part where he was figuring out the shape of it. He knew the shape. He paid for his coffee and went to his meeting and thought about load-bearing structures and what it meant to trust one. The dinner with Marcus and Priya and Reed and Danny happened in week 9 at Reed's place, and this time nobody was watching anyone. It was just dinner, loud and overlapping and running too late, the way group dinners did when the food ran out, but nobody wanted to be the first to say it was time to go. At some point, Danny said something that made Avery laugh. A real one, the loose kind Wyatt had only heard a few times, the kind she hadn't figured out yet whether to pull back. Marcus looked at Wyatt across the table with the expression of a man who knew he'd gotten away with something by accident. Wyatt ignored him. But later, in the car, on the way home, Avery said, "They like me." "Yes." "I wasn't expecting that." He glanced at her. "Did you think they wouldn't?" "I thought they'd be careful about it. Polite, you know, the kind of warmth that's really just good manners." She looked at her hands in her lap. "It wasn't that." "No," he said. It wasn't. She was quiet for a block. "Priya told me she'd been worried you'd never let anyone in. She said," Avery paused, choosing what to share. "She said you had this thing where you were warm with everyone, but actually with almost no one." Wyatt didn't answer right away. The light ahead went yellow, and he slowed. "She's right," he said. "I know," Avery said. "I recognized it." She looked at him. "I do it too." The light changed. He drove. "You're different," she said, in case that wasn't clear, from what she described. Her voice was even, but he'd learned enough by now to know that evenness was how she carried things that had weight to them. "You're in, Wyatt. Not careful in. Actually in." He thought about the bridge over Carver Canal. He thought about load-bearing structures and what it meant to trust what something could hold. "Yeah," he said, "I am." She nodded once and looked back out the window and didn't say anything else, and didn't need to. The confrontation with Marcus and the others had settled into something that functioned like resolution. They'd apologized, Avery had accepted it, and the group had moved forward with the particular efficiency of people who'd decided the alternative was worse. But there was a difference, Wyatt had noticed, between something being resolved and something being finished. And the thing with his friends was resolved, but not entirely finished, because Avery carried it differently than she let on. He saw it in small ways. When Marcus texted the group about dinner and Avery's name was included, she'd respond, but always a beat later than necessary, the way you responded when you were deciding whether to show up rather than assuming you belonged there. When Priya asked her something personal at one of those dinners, something genuine, not small talk, Avery answered but kept one layer back, like a woman who'd learned that warmth extended toward you could be a setup for something else. He didn't push it. She was entitled to her own pace with people who'd given her reason for caution. But he watched, and he understood that the thing his friends had done in that restaurant had cost more than a single apology could fully pay back. What he didn't know, what she hadn't told him yet, was that the restaurant incident had landed on top of something older and heavier. That the discomfort of being watched and evaluated by people who claimed to care about her was not a new experience, that she had a template for it, built years before Marcus and Priya and Reed had ever sat down at a table with their water glasses angled in the wrong direction. He found out on a Wednesday evening in late August, the kind of evening that arrived at the end of a long week and felt like a reprieve, warm without being hot, the light going amber by 7, the city quieting in degrees. They were at her apartment, which was on the 14th floor with a view of the western skyline that she never seemed to look at, as if she'd stopped seeing it the way you stopped seeing anything that was always there. He was on the couch with his project files. She was at her desk doing something with spreadsheets, and they'd been in that comfortable parallel silence for an hour when her phone rang and she looked at the screen and went completely still. Not the stillness of someone deciding whether to answer, the stillness of someone who had been ambushed. She answered. She turned slightly away from him, not walking to another room, just a small pivot, the body's reflex for privacy. He heard her say, "I see," and then, "How did you get this number?" And then a silence that went on long enough that he looked up from his files. Her back was to him. Her shoulders were level and controlled in the way that meant she was working to keep them that way. She said, "Don't call again," and hung up. She sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. He waited. "That was my ex-husband," she said, still facing away. He put his files down. She turned around. Her expression was the controlled one, the one she wore in boardrooms when something had gone sideways and she was deciding how to handle it before anyone else saw which way she was going to move. It was a good expression for boardrooms. He'd come to understand that she used it everywhere when she needed time, and he'd come to understand that what was underneath it was usually something she hadn't yet decided to say. "You were married," he said, "for 4 years. She set the phone on the desk with the deliberate care of someone setting down something they don't want to drop. "I don't talk about it, not because I'm hiding it, just because She stopped. "I got good at not looking at it." He nodded slowly. "Okay. His name is Daniel Voss. We met before the accident. We were married when it happened." Oh, she said it with the flat economy of someone giving a report, keeping the emotion at arm's length through the mechanism of information. He stayed for the first year, the surgery, the initial rehab, the worst of it. He was... She paused, and for a moment something moved across her face that was not the controlled expression, just the real one, briefly. He was present, at first. I think he meant to be what he said he was going to be. "But," Wyatt said. "But recovery is not a single event," she said. "It's a long, unglamorous process that doesn't resolve on a timeline that's convenient for anyone." And somewhere in the second year he started, she searched for the word, managing me. The way you manage a situation you're not sure you signed up for. Making decisions around me instead of with me. Talking to my doctors before talking to me. Arranging things. She looked at her hands. He thought he was helping. I know that. But what it felt like was being slowly reclassified. From his wife to his... She stopped again. "Project," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "Yes, exactly that." He kept his voice even. How long before he left? He didn't leave. I asked him to go. She said it without particular pride or bitterness, just true. 2.5 years after the accident, he'd already emotionally checked out. I could tell, had been able to tell for months. He just hadn't said it yet because he thought leaving a disabled wife made him a bad person. And he was too concerned about what kind of person he was to be honest about what kind of husband he'd become. A pause. I made the decision for both of us. It was cleaner that way. Did it feel clean? She looked at him steadily. No, she said. It felt like the second worst thing that had happened to me in 2 years. He didn't say he was sorry because she'd made it clear early what she thought of that, and because sorry wasn't the right word anyway. What he felt was something closer to anger, a quiet, specific anger at a man he'd never met, for the particular way he'd managed to make Avery feel like a thing to be handled during the most disorienting period of her life. What does he want? Wyatt said. He said closure. She said the word with a faint contempt she didn't bother hiding. He's getting remarried. He said he wanted to... She made a brief gesture, dismissive, clear the air. His words. Clear the air for himself, Wyatt said. That's my read, yes. What do you want to do? She looked at him, and he could see her processing the question. Not just what he was asking, but the fact that he was asking it rather than telling her. I don't know yet, she said. Okay. I might want to see him. She said it carefully, watching his face. Not because I want to give him what he wants, but because I have things I never said, and I've been carrying them for 4 years, and I think... She stopped. I think I'm done carrying them. He held her gaze. Then see him. You're not going to say anything about that? Like what? Like that it's a bad idea, or that I'm reopening something, or that he doesn't deserve... He doesn't deserve anything from you, Wyatt said. But that's not the point. If you have things you need to say, and saying them closes something you've been holding open, then you should say them. He leaned forward slightly. It's not my decision. She looked at him for a long moment. Most people would have an opinion. I have an opinion. My opinion is that whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere. She was quiet. The amber light had gone, the room settling into the blue-gray of early evening. I'll think about it, she said. Take your time. She picked up her phone from the desk, looked at it once, then put it face down. She turned back to her spreadsheets, but he could see she wasn't working, just looking at the screen, somewhere inside her own head. He picked up his project files again. He didn't push. He waited, the way he'd learned she needed him to, and the apartment held them both in its quiet. She thought about it for 11 days. He knew because she'd mentioned it once, on the phone, in passing. I'm still thinking about the Daniel thing. And then, not again, and he didn't ask, because asking would have been the wrong kind of attention. He let it exist on her side of the equation and trusted that she'd say something when she was ready. She called him on a Thursday morning, early, before his first meeting. I'm going to see him, she said. Okay. Saturday. He's in town through the weekend. We're meeting at the Carver Hotel, the bar on the lobby level. Public, neutral, not somewhere either of us has been before. Smart. I picked it. A pause. I'm not asking you to come. I know. I'm also not asking you to stay away. She stopped. I don't need you to be there, but I wanted you to know where I was. He understood the distinction. It was not about needing rescue. It was about someone knowing your coordinates. I'll be around, he said. Call me after if you want. I will, she said. Or I'll be fine and I'll call you later. Either one. A small silence. He's going to try to make it about him, she said. He always made things about himself, not aggressively, just. The gravity of his feelings was always slightly larger than the situation warranted. Then you're already ahead of him. I know I am. She said it simply, not with arrogance, just with the certainty of someone who had spent years building the version of herself that walked into rooms prepared. I just wanted to say it out loud. Noted, he said. He told Marcus, because Marcus would find out anyway, and Wyatt preferred to control how information moved in his friendships. He gave the minimum necessary. Avery's ex-husband had surfaced, she was handling it, it was her business and not a group conversation item. Marcus said, Do you want to be there? She didn't ask me to be. That's not what I asked. Wyatt thought about it, standing in the parking lot outside the municipal building with his coffee going cold. Yeah, he said. I want to be there. But it's not about what I want. You're very calm about this. I trust her. A silence. Huh, Marcus said. What? Nothing, just a pause. You've never said that about anyone. Not like that. Like it's just a fact. Wyatt picked up his coffee. It is just a fact. After he hung up, he stood for a moment in the parking lot and acknowledged to himself that he wasn't entirely calm. There was a specific quality to the feeling. Not jealousy, not quite fear, but the particular discomfort of caring about someone who was going to walk into a room with a version of their own past. And you could not go in front of them, and you could not stand beside them. You could only be somewhere nearby and trust that they came back. He thought, in the early months with Avery, that trust was something you built gradually through accumulated evidence, that you extended it in proportional increments as the proof warranted. He thought it was structural, the way load-bearing things were structural. What he was learning was that there was a point where trust stopped being structural and became something else, something more like a choice you made without a full guarantee, because the alternative, which was to not trust, to hedge, to manage her the way Daniel had managed her, was worse than the uncertainty. He made the choice. He let her go. Saturday came with low clouds and the particular stillness of a day that was waiting to see what it was going to be. Wyatt took Lily to her soccer practice in the morning, stood on the sideline in the cool air, and watched her chase the ball with the pure and uncomplicated commitment of a child who was not yet calculating odds, and thought about nothing and everything at the same time. On the drive home, Lily said, "You're doing the thing." What thing? The thing where you're here but your brain is somewhere else. He glanced at her in the mirror. Sorry. Is Avery okay? He considered how much to say. She's dealing with something from before I knew her. She's handling it. Lily processed this in her usual way, absorbing it, filing it, not pressing. Then, the handling kind or the pretending to handle kind? He looked at her in the mirror again longer this time. The real kind, he said. She's good at it. Lily nodded. Okay, she said, and picked up her book from the seat beside her, and that was that. Avery texted him at 12:47, going in. He was at his house, at the kitchen counter with his laptop and a sandwich he wasn't eating. He typed back, I'm here. And then he put the phone face up on the counter where he could see it, and he opened his project files, and he tried to work. He did not particularly succeed at working. He read the same paragraph of a drainage report 4 times and retained none of it. He got up and washed the lunch dishes. He sat back down. He thought about a woman in a hotel bar telling a man who had once been her husband that she was done carrying what he'd left her with, and he thought about the version of Avery he'd first met, the defended one, the one who'd told him in the first 10 minutes that she didn't want sympathy, and about how much of that had been built in the 2.5 years of a marriage slowly becoming something else. He thought about the distinction between standing in front of someone and standing beside them. It was a distinction he'd been thinking about more than he'd expected to when this all started. He'd always thought of himself as the kind of man who showed up, who handled things, fixed things, made sure things were running. What he was learning, slowly and with some resistance, was that showing up didn't always mean being visible. That sometimes showing up meant staying out of the way and being available, which was a quieter and considerably harder version of the same impulse. He'd failed at this before, in smaller ways. He'd stepped in when Avery was handling something, and his stepping in had landed as doubt in her capability rather than support, and she'd told him so, directly and without cruelty, and he'd had to sit with the fact that his instinct to help was not always experienced as help. He was better at it now. Not perfect. He still caught himself sometimes moving toward a problem that was hers to solve, stopped himself, stepped back. But better. He thought, not for the first time, that loving someone was mostly the practice of adjusting your understanding of what they needed and then doing that instead of what felt natural to you. It was less romantic than it sounded. It was also more important. She called at 2:15. I'm outside, she said. Her voice was even, which told him nothing because her voice was always even when something had weight to it. How was it? A long exhale. He looks older, she said, which was not what he'd expected. He came in looking like a man who'd prepared what he was going to say, and I could see the preparation on his face, and I thought, he's been rehearsing this. He's been managing this meeting in his head for weeks. What happened when the rehearsal ran out? About 12 minutes in. A pause. I let him say the things he'd prepared to say. The apology, the explanation, the way he framed things as I wasn't equipped rather than I failed you, which is a specific kind of evasion I recognized immediately. Her voice was still level, but he could hear the texture underneath it, the feeling moving through the even tone like current under still water. And then I told him something. He waited. I told him that what I'd needed from him in that second year was not management. It was just presence, not solutions, not decisions made around me, not the performance of a man holding things together, just someone who sat in the difficulty with me and didn't treat it like a problem to be solved. She paused. I told him that what he gave me instead was the experience of being reclassified, of going from a person he was in a marriage with to a situation he was responsible for. And I told him that I had spent 4 years being more careful about letting people in as a direct result of that reclassification, and that he didn't get to call that closure for himself without understanding what it cost me. The kitchen was very quiet. How did he take it? Wyatt said. He cried. She said it without contempt, but without softness either. Real tears, I think. I'm not sure it matters. A beat. I didn't comfort him. I just let him sit in it. I think that was the right call. Yeah, Wyatt said. It was. He asked if I was happy. Her voice shifted slightly on the word, not breaking, just changing texture. And I thought about the question for a moment because it's not a simple question and I don't trust simple answers, and then I said yes, and I meant it. A pause. I think that was the hardest part for him. Not the things I said about what he'd done, but the fact that I was actually fine. Wyatt looked at the kitchen wall. Outside, Lily was in the backyard with her soccer ball, the thud of it against the fence coming through the window in a steady rhythm. Are you okay? He said. Yes. She said it immediately, then paused. Ask me again. Are you okay? A longer pause. I'm tired, she said. I've been carrying that for 4 years, and putting it down should feel lighter, and it does. A little, but I think I'm also just tired of the weight of it having been there so long. Another pause. I'm going to go home and sit with it for a while. Okay? I might want to see you later. I don't know yet. I'm here either way. I know, she said. I know. After they hung up, he sat at the counter for a moment, not moving. Then he got up and went to the back door and opened it, and Lily looked up from the yard. She okay? Lily said. Yeah, he said. She's okay. Lily nodded, kicked the ball at the fence once more, and went back to her rhythm. She came over that evening at 7, without calling first, which was not something she'd done before. He heard the car in the driveway and went to the door, and she was at the top of the porch steps with her jacket buttoned up against the evening cool and her hair down and an expression on her face that he recognized as the post-offended one, the one that appeared when she'd spent everything on the controlled version and had arrived at a place where she didn't have any left for the performance. Hi, he said. Hi. A pause. I didn't call. I noticed. Is that okay? Yeah, he said. Come in. Lily was in the living room with her book, and she looked up when Avery came in and said hi with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had already decided where Avery fit and didn't need to renegotiate it. Hi, Lily, Avery said. Are you staying for dinner? Lily said. Not with the careful neutrality of a child checking the temperature, but with the directness of one issuing an invitation. Avery looked at Wyatt. She's asking if you want to stay, he said. I heard what she asked. She looked back at Lily. Yes. If that's okay. Dad made too much pasta anyway, Lily said, and went back to her book. Avery looked at the top of Lily's head for a moment with that particular expression, the private one she didn't always mean to show, and then she came into the kitchen where Wyatt was already pulling plates from the cabinet, and she sat at the kitchen table. And she didn't say anything for a minute, just sat in the warmth of the kitchen and let it be around her. He put a plate in front of her without asking. She picked up a fork without thanking him, which meant she was too tired for the formalities, and he'd gotten to the level of trust where that was okay. He asked if he could reach out again sometime, she said, when I was leaving. Wyatt sat down with his own plate. What did you say? I said I'd prefer he didn't. She moved the pasta around with her fork. He nodded like that was what he expected. I think part of him thought I'd give him something, the absolution, or the friendliness, or the version of it where we part ways nicely, and he gets to feel like he's not the man who left. She looked up. I didn't give him any of it. Good. It felt... She paused, looking for the word. Austere. Not cold, but austere. Like I'd decided what was mine to give, and given it, and the rest was his problem. That's exactly right, he said. She looked at him. You're very sure. You went in there and you said the things you needed to say, and you didn't soften them for his comfort. That's not cruelty. That's just accurate. She considered that. My therapist, years ago, used to say that some apologies were really just requests for absolution dressed up as accountability. She looked at her plate. Daniel's was that. He wanted me to say it was okay so he could stop feeling like someone who did something. But it wasn't okay? Wyatt said. No, she said. It wasn't. She looked at him. He wasn't a monster. I want to be clear about that. He was a person who ran out of something he should have had more of, and I've made my peace with the fact that people have limits. A pause. What I wasn't going to do was tell him the limits didn't matter. Lily came to the table without being called, which meant she'd decided dinner was ready, and sat down with her book still in one hand and started eating with the other. Lily, Wyatt said. She put the book down. I was going to ask a question. Ask it with the book down. She put it on the table with the slightly martyred air of someone complying under protest. I was going to ask, she said to Avery, if you were better. Avery looked at her. Better? Dad said you were handling something. You look like you handled it. Lily tilted her head. But sometimes after you handle something, you need a minute. Avery held the child's gaze for a moment. 7 years old, Wyatt thought, and she'd just said a more useful thing than most adults managed. I do need a minute, Avery said, but I'm better than I was this morning. Lily nodded, satisfied. She picked up her fork. Thank you for asking, Avery said. Lily shrugged in the way of children receiving compliments they haven't decided what to do with yet. It's just obvious when someone needs a minute, she said. You just look. They put Lily to bed together. Not planned, just the natural result of the evening having proceeded the way it had. Wyatt doing the routine and Avery leaning in the doorway of Lily's room while he tucked her in and turned off the lamp, and Lily reaching out from under the blanket and finding Avery's hand in the dark and holding it for a second before letting go. It was a small thing. Lily didn't make anything of it. She was already drifting towards sleep, her hand back under the blanket, her face turned toward the window. But Wyatt saw Avery in the doorway after, and she was standing very still with her hand at her side, and her expression was the open one, all the way open, not a fragment of the controlled version left. And he thought, there it is. That's what it looks like when it lands. He pulled the door partway closed and they stood in the hallway, and she said nothing, and he said nothing. And after a moment she turned toward him and put her forehead against his shoulder, and he put his arms around her, and they stayed like that in the quiet hallway. Not because she was broken, not because the day had cracked her, but because she had put down something very heavy, and he was there, and letting him hold some of the weight for a minute was not a failure of independence. It was just what you did when someone had earned the right to stand next to you in the dark. He thought about what she'd said to Daniel, about presence versus management, about the difference between someone who sat in the difficulty with you and someone who tried to process it away. He thought about whether he'd been doing it right, whether he'd stood far enough back today, whether he'd come close enough now, whether he'd read the difference correctly. He thought he had. He wasn't sure he'd always been right about it, but today he thought he had. She pulled back after a while, looked at him. Her eyes were clear, tired, but clear. He asked if I was happy, she said again. And the thing is, she paused. I haven't been asked that in a long time. Not in a way that felt like a real question. Most people ask it as a greeting. She looked at him. But standing there, in that hotel bar, I thought about it honestly, and the honest answer was yes, and I said it. You meant it, he said. I did. She held his gaze. I do. He looked at her in the dim hallway light and thought about a year ago. The restaurant, the table near the window, the woman who had told him she didn't want sympathy in the first 10 minutes because she'd decided it was better to be honest about who she was than to waste time finding out the hard way whether he could handle it. He thought about how much she'd changed since then, and how much she hadn't, and how the version of her standing in this hallway was not a different person from the one he'd met. Just someone who'd had the chance to set down a thing she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her. I'm glad you went, he said. Me too, she said. I didn't need it to be different than it was. I just needed it to be done. She looked toward Lily's door. She held my hand. Yeah. She did it like it was nothing. That's how she does things, he said. Lily doesn't perform kindness. She just does it and moves on. Avery was quiet for a moment, then, she gets that from you. He shook his head. She was born that way. I just try not to mess it up. Avery looked at him, and the small smile appeared, the one that reached everything. You're not messing it up, she said. They went back to the kitchen and finished the evening with tea and low conversation, the kind that moved easily between small things and large ones without any particular destination, and the house was quiet around them in the way it was quiet when the people inside it were not performing ease, but actually at ease. Later, when she left, she had an early call in the morning. She always had early calls. He walked her to her car, and she turned at the door and looked at him with the expression that had become, over weeks and months, one of the things he thought he'd carry for the rest of his life, regardless of how anything else turned out. Thank you, she said, for today. I didn't do anything today. You were here. She held his gaze. You didn't try to fix it, and you didn't try to come in front of it, and you didn't make it about whether you were okay with it. You just... She stopped, and he saw her jaw move. You were just here. He thought about saying that it wasn't hard. It wasn't entirely true. It had taken something, the staying back, the trusting. But it had also been the only option that made sense if he actually respected who she was. And he did. He did respect who she was. That was not a performance, and it was not patience, and it was not the practiced tolerance of someone trying to prove they were good enough for the situation. It was just the thing he actually felt. You didn't need me in front of it, he said. You never did. She nodded once. Then she got in her car, and he stood on the driveway until the taillights turned off his street, and then he went back inside to the quiet house. Lily's light was off. The kitchen was warm. The evening had asked a lot of both of them in different ways, and they had both come through it, and nothing about that was simple or perfect or clean. It was just true. He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, in the particular stillness of a house, at the end of a day that had mattered, and thought about what it meant to love someone who did not need you to carry their weight, but allowed you, sometimes, to stand close enough that they didn't have to carry it entirely alone. He thought that was probably the whole point of it. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The week after Avery walked out of that hotel lobby, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. It was quieter than that. The kind of shift you only recognize later, when you're looking back at a before and an after and trying to find the exact moment one became the other. Wyatt noticed it first in the small things. She called instead of texted, sometimes, which she hadn't done much before. Not long calls. She wasn't a long call person, but real ones. The kind where someone just wants to hear a voice rather than read words on a screen. She'd call from her car after a late meeting, or from the kitchen while she was figuring out what to eat, and they'd talk about nothing in particular for 20 minutes, and then she'd say she had to go and he'd say goodnight, and that would be enough. He noticed it in the way she looked at Lily, too. There had always been warmth there, man. From the very first evening, she'd been genuine with her in a way that couldn't be faked. But now it was something else. Now when Lily said something sharp or funny or oddly wise, Avery would look at the kid with an expression that Wyatt had only seen on her face in unguarded moments, private, almost soft, like something she hadn't exactly meant to show. Lily, for her part, was tracking all of it with her usual unnerving precision. "She's here more," Lily said one morning over cereal in the conversational tone of someone presenting an observation rather than a complaint. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "I don't mind." "I know you don't." Lily stirred her cereal. "She stayed kind of late last night." He kept his eyes on his coffee. "She did. Is she your girlfriend?" He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with the patient expression of someone who already knew the answer and was asking as a formality. "Yeah," he said. "She is." Lily considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to her cereal with the air of a case closed. He told Avery about it that evening, on the phone, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "She really said okay and just went back to eating? She really did. That child is remarkable. She's going to find out you keep using that word, and she'll tell you it's imprecise." Avery laughed, and he heard something in it, a specific quality, relaxed in a way she hadn't quite been before, like a muscle that had been braced and had only now decided it could let go. "I want to say something," she said. He waited. She paused, and he could tell she was picking her words carefully, not because she was being evasive, but because she wanted them to be right. "I've kept a certain amount of distance, not from you specifically, just as a general operating mode. It's how I've run my life for a long time, and I know it, and most of the time it's served me fine." A beat. "I'm saying I don't want to do that anymore. With you. I've been aware of it for a while, and I've just been..." "Careful," he said. "Careful," she agreed. "And I think I'm done being careful." He said nothing for a moment, just let that sit where she'd put it. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Yeah." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm not going anywhere." She was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. "I know," she said finally. "That's why I said it." The relationship, because that was what it was now, clearly, without the need for further discussion, had a texture to it that Wyatt hadn't experienced before. Not with Lily's mother, not with anyone from the years before Lily. What he and Avery had was something that had been built slowly enough that every layer had dried before the next one went on, and that meant it was solid in a way that felt different from things that had moved faster and looked more impressive earlier. They disagreed, sometimes significantly. Avery had opinions about how Wyatt managed his work schedule. She thought he undercharged for consultation hours and overcommitted to project timelines to avoid conflict with clients, and she said so without softening it. He told her she was right, but he was going to change it on his own timeline, not hers. She accepted that with some visible effort. He had thoughts about the way she ran herself into the ground between Monday and Friday and spent weekends half present because her brain never fully left the office. He said so once, directly, and she got quiet in the way she got when something hit close enough to be uncomfortable. Then she said, "I know, I've known for years it's not as simple as deciding to stop." He said he understood it wasn't simple, he was just naming it. She said she appreciated that he'd named it without making it a verdict. He said he wasn't there to give verdicts. They had the kind of arguments that came from two people who were both used to being the most capable person in any given room and who had to learn, with some friction, how to be in the same room as each other's competence without it becoming a competition. The friction was real. But it didn't go anywhere bad. It just resolved, usually somewhere between where they'd each started, and they'd both end up slightly adjusted, and neither of them had to pretend they'd never pushed back. That was new for Wyatt. The women he'd dated before, the few and brief, had either deferred to him more than they should, or had turned disagreement into something that felt like a verdict on who he was, rather than just a difference of opinion. Avery argued like someone who was interested in the problem, not in winning. That distinction mattered more than he'd realized it would. They told their friends over dinner at Marcus's place on a Saturday in October, which is to say they arrived together in the same car, and Danny took one look at them and said, "Finally," before they'd taken their coats off. "Was it that obvious?" Avery said. "To everyone except you two, apparently," Priya said from the kitchen doorway. "We were aware," Wyatt said. "We were being thoughtful." "You were being slow," Reed said from the couch. Same thing, different perspective. The evening had the ease of a group that had settled into itself. The specific comfort of people who'd been through something together, however small, and come out the other side still intact. Avery fit into it in a way that was no longer effortful. She was just there, in the middle of the argument about whether Marcus had overcooked the chicken, holding her own against Danny's entirely correct position that he had. At one point, Priya sat next to Wyatt in the kitchen while he was opening another bottle, and she said, low enough that it was just between them, "You look different." Different how? Less like you're waiting for something bad to happen. He considered that. Maybe I'm not anymore. Priya looked across the room to where Avery was explaining, with the patient clarity she used on problems that mattered to her, exactly how Marcus had failed the chicken. "She's good," Priya said. I want you to know I see that. I know I was part of how that whole beginning went, and I know it wasn't. I could have just introduced you." "Probably," he said. "But it worked out." "Priya." He looked at her. "It worked out. We're past it." He handed her a glass. "She's past it." Priya nodded. "Good." She took the glass. "Keep her." "That's the plan." Lily's birthday was in November, and Wyatt had been running the logistics of it in the background for weeks. The party at the community center, the cake from the bakery on Clement Street that Lily had specified with the precision of a project manager, the list of 8 kids that had been negotiated down from 14 through a series of difficult conversations about venue capacity. He hadn't exactly invited Avery to the party. He'd mentioned it existed. He'd said the date. He had, in what he recognized as classic Wyatt Grayson conflict avoidance, not quite gotten around to saying the explicit sentence, "Will you come?" Avery had apparently decided to resolve this herself, because 3 days before the party, she sent him a text that said, "I'm coming to the birthday party. I've already ordered something. Don't tell me I shouldn't. It's too late." He texted back, "I was going to ask." Her reply, "You were going to get around to it eventually, yes." He stared at his phone and thought that she knew him too well already, and that this was both alarming and the best thing that had happened to him in years. The party was the barely controlled mayhem of 8 7-year-olds given access to an arts and crafts table and moderate quantities of sugar. Wyatt's sister Elena was there running crowd control, which she did with the authoritative ease of someone who taught 3rd grade and had long since lost all fear of children in groups. Avery arrived midway through, with a package under one arm and the particular expression she wore when she was in an environment she hadn't been in before and was doing a quick spatial assessment. Lily saw her from across the room and broke out of the group she was in and navigated through the chaos with a directness that parted the other children like water. "You came," Lily said. "I said I would." "You didn't say you would." "Your dad mentioned the party. I said I was coming." Avery held out the package. "Happy birthday." Lily took it with both hands and looked at it with the careful scrutiny of a child who opens gifts slowly because she wants to actually look at the thing. She undid the wrapping with more patience than most adults managed and pulled out a drafting kit, real quality, not a child's toy version, with a proper set of technical pens and a small professional sketchbook and a folded piece of paper inside that Lily opened and read, lips moving slightly. "It's a certificate," Lily said. "For a design course," Avery said. "Online, self-paced. I checked the curriculum. It's the junior version of what actual industrial designers start with. You can do it at your own speed." She paused. "I could be wrong about whether you'd like it, but based on your drawings, I thought you might." Lily looked at the certificate for a moment longer. Then she looked up. "Did you design this?" "The certificate?" "Yes." "It looks professional. I have a graphic designer on staff. I sent him a description." Lily nodded slowly, with the expression of someone placing a data point in a larger pattern they'd been building. Then she said, "Thank you." Not the automatic thank you of social performance, but the real kind, measured and specific. Elena materialized at Wyatt's shoulder and said, very quietly, "She doesn't say real thank yous to anyone." "I know," he said. "Okay," Elena said. "I like her." "I know," he said again. Mom. It was a Sunday in December when he told her. Not a planned moment, not a dinner he'd set up, or a location he'd chosen. It was his kitchen, mid-afternoon, the light coming through the back window the way winter light did, low and flat and still somehow warm against the walls. Lily was at a birthday party of her own. The house was quiet. Avery had been there since noon, working on something at the kitchen table while he dealt with a project report on his laptop at the counter. They'd been in the same room for 3 hours, mostly silent, occasionally saying things, and the silence had the quality he'd come to recognize as one of the best things about being around her. It wasn't empty, it was just comfortable. Two people existing in the same space without needing to perform their presence. She said something about a vendor negotiation she'd been going back and forth on, asked his opinion, and he gave it, and they went back and forth on it for a few minutes. And then she said something dry about her VP of sales that made him laugh, and he looked at her across the kitchen and thought, I love her. Not the discovery of it. He'd known that for weeks, he'd just been waiting to be sure he meant it the way it deserved to be meant. But there it was, in his own kitchen, in the flat winter light, over a conversation about vendor negotiations. And he thought, there's no better time than this. I have to say something, he said. She looked up from her screen. Okay? I love you. She didn't move for a moment. Her eyes were on him, and he could see her processing it. Not with doubt, not with fear, but carefully, the way she did everything that mattered. Not because of what you went through, he said. Not because of the accident or what came after, or the way you rebuilt things. That's your story, and it's extraordinary, but it's not why. He pushed his laptop aside. It's because of who you actually are, the way you think, the way you talk to my daughter like she's a whole person, the way you tell me when I'm wrong, the way you called me from your car 3 weeks ago just to talk. I don't know. It's everything specific. He paused. That's it. I just needed to say it. The kitchen was very quiet. Avery set her pen down. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Open, actually open, without the edges she used to keep the world at a manageable distance. Her jaw was set in the way it was when she was holding on to something and deciding what to do with it. I've been in love with you, she said, for longer than I've let myself say. He looked at her. Since the waterfront, she said. That Sunday. The pavement was uneven, and I said the city was a liability, and you told me you'd written reports about it, and I thought... She stopped, and something crossed her face that was almost like frustration with herself. I thought, he's been paying attention to things I didn't even know he knew to pay attention to. Not about me specifically, just about the world. He looks at things and wants them to be right. She picked up her pen and put it down again. I've been in relationships where the person saw what I'd accomplished and felt something like admiration that was actually intimidation in a better coat. Or they felt sorry for me in ways they thought they were hiding. Or they were performing patience like it was a virtue they could get credit for. Her voice was even, but her eyes weren't. You've never done any of that. You just showed up, kept showing up, like it was the most obvious thing. It was, he said. I know, that's what I mean. She looked at him steadily. I love you, Wyatt. I have for a while. I was just being careful. Yes. You said you were done being careful. I did. Her mouth curved slightly. I meant it. He crossed the kitchen. He didn't make a production of it. He just moved across the space between them and crouched down so they were level and put his hand on the side of her face, and she leaned into it, and he kissed her in a way that had nothing to do with the first date uncertainty of earlier months, just two people who knew each other and had finally stopped hedging around what that meant. When they broke apart, she had both hands in his and was looking at him in the particular way she looked at things she was deciding to keep. You have flour on your shirt, she said. He looked down. From lunch, apparently. Noted. It's a good shirt. Thank you. She laughed. The real one, the unguarded one. He thought he'd never get tired of that sound. The weeks that followed were not easy in the way that things in stories were easy. Not the sort of easy where problems dissolved and everything unfolded in a warm and cooperative light. Real life continued to present itself with its usual requirements. Wyatt had a bridge assessment go sideways in January when a contractor disputed his findings, and it became a 6-week argument with the county. Avery had a product launch that she'd been building toward for 2 years, Hit a technical problem a week out and spent 3 consecutive days running on very little sleep and a level of intensity that made her team run interference at the office door. Lily got a stomach virus that lasted 4 days, and Wyatt ran on no sleep and panic texted Avery at 2 in the morning when the fever wouldn't come down, and Avery talked him through it calmly from her apartment at 2 a.m. because she'd looked up the threshold numbers and confirmed he was still in the safe range, and she stayed on the phone until Lily's temperature broke. In the morning, Lily said groggily, "Was that Avery on the phone?" "Yeah." "At 2 in the morning?" "Yeah." Lily considered this from under her blanket. "She stayed on the phone the whole time?" "Yeah." A pause. "She's good," Lily said, and went back to sleep. It was, Wyatt thought, the most complete endorsement he'd ever received on someone else's behalf. Avery met Wyatt's parents in February at a Sunday dinner his mother organized with approximately 2 weeks of advance notice and a menu that indicated she had been planning it considerably longer than that. His mother cooked enough for 8 people when there were 5. His father shook Avery's hand and said, "Good to meet you," and then spent the next 3 hours asking her questions about her company with the genuine interest of a retired mechanical engineer who found the application of adaptive technology fascinating. Avery answered every question fully, without the performance she gave at business dinners. She just talked, because he was asking real questions, and she liked real questions. Wyatt's mother sat next to Wyatt in the kitchen while he was helping clear the second course and said, in the way his mother had always said important things, sideways, while doing something else, "She doesn't let anyone take care of her." "No," he said, "but she lets you." He thought about the night of Lily's fever, about Avery staying on the phone at 2 in the morning, about the way she'd said "call me if it gets worse" and meant it as a two-way thing, not just her available to him, but her acknowledging that this was something shared now, something that happened to one of them and mattered to both. "Sometimes," he said, "she's working on it." "So are you," his mother said without heat. He looked at her. "You were better at being needed than at needing," she said, "for a long time." She handed him a stack of plates. "She's not the only one who's changed?" He carried the plates to the dining room and thought about that, about the specific ways Avery had made him different without trying to, just by being someone you couldn't keep your distance from without consciously choosing it every day. And he'd stopped choosing it a long time ago. There was a Tuesday evening in March, nothing special about the date, when the 3 of them were at Wyatt's place and Lily was doing her homework, and Avery was on the couch with a binder of documents she was annotating, and Wyatt was cooking, and the radio was on low, and the kitchen was warm, and Lily said, to no one in particular, "This is nice." Neither adult said anything for a moment. "Yeah," Wyatt said. Avery didn't say anything. She looked at the binder, and then she looked at Lily, and then she looked across the kitchen at Wyatt, and the expression on her face was the unguarded one, the private, almost soft one she didn't always mean to show. He looked back at her and didn't say anything either, because there wasn't anything to say that the room wasn't already saying better. Outside, the streetlights were coming on. The city went about its business. Inside the kitchen, something that had been built slowly and carefully and without guarantees settled into itself like a structure that had been tested and held, and the 3 people inside it went on with their evening, not making much of it because it was theirs, and they didn't need anyone else to witness it. That was enough. That, Wyatt thought, was actually everything. Spring came the way it always did in this city, not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm week followed by a cold snap, then 2 days of rain, then a morning where the light came through the kitchen window at a different angle than it had the day before, and something in the air had changed, and you knew, without being told, that winter had finally decided to let go. Wyatt noticed the shift on a Thursday morning in late April, standing at the counter with his coffee while Lily ate breakfast and argued with him about whether it was warm enough to go without her jacket. He looked out the back window at the yard, the small square of it, the maple his father had helped him plant 4 years ago when Lily was 3, and had insisted on also planting a stick, which was not how trees worked but which Wyatt had quietly staked and watered anyway, because she'd been so certain, and thought that the tree was doing what it did every year, and so was everything else. "You need the jacket," he said. "I'll be hot." You'll be cold until noon, and then you'll be fine. Lily looked at him with the expression of someone who had already decided not to win this particular argument and was saving her energy for a more strategic hill. She picked up the jacket. He counted that as a victory, which meant he was getting slower in his old age because she'd been conceding the jacket every day for a week, and he was only now noticing. Avery texted at 7:42. "Are you still coming tonight?" He typed back, "Yes, 6:30. I told you." Her reply, "You said probably 6:30. I said 6:30. You said around 6:30 probably." He looked at the text for a moment, then, "I'll be there at 6:30. 3 dots. Then, "Thank you for the precision." He set his phone down and finished his coffee and thought about the fact that she remembered the exact words of what he'd said and he didn't, and that this was extremely on brand for both of them and had stopped bothering him approximately 4 months ago. The anniversary, if that was what you called it, the 1-year mark of a night that had started as a setup and become something neither of them had planned for, was in 6 days. He'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks, not in the way he sometimes thought about things, which was to turn them over and over until all the uncertainty was worn down into something manageable, but in a quieter way, a way that was less about planning and more about feeling the weight of the year and wanting to name it somehow. He'd made a reservation at Collier's on 5th, the same restaurant, same general area, same hostess stand, same window view of the street. It had felt, when he'd made the call, like the right kind of full circle. Not sentimental in a forced way, but honest in the way that returning to a place where something important happened and not being afraid of it was honest. He hadn't told Avery where they were going. He'd said dinner, Friday, dress for something nice. "I'll pick you up at 7. She'd said, "Why won't you tell me?" And he'd said, "Because I want you to see it when we get there." And she'd been quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay," in a way that told him she was deciding to trust the thing instead of managing it, which was still new enough for her that he appreciated the choice it represented. He also hadn't told her about the other part. That was between him and Lily for now, and Lily had been carrying the secret with the gravity of someone entrusted with something real, which meant she'd told approximately no one, which was better than he'd expected from a 7-year-old. The conversation with Lily had happened 3 weeks earlier, on a Sunday afternoon, in the car on the way back from the hardware store where they'd gone to get light bulbs and come out with light bulbs, a small toolbox organizer, and a package of those adhesive hooks that Lily was convinced would solve a problem with her backpack she hadn't fully articulated yet. He'd turned off the radio and said, "I want to talk to you about something." Lily had looked over from the passenger seat. "The Avery thing." He'd paused. "Yeah." "I figured." He'd kept his eyes on the road. "I'm thinking about asking her to marry me." A silence. Long enough that he'd glanced over. Lily was looking at the package of adhesive hooks in her lap, not with any particular expression, just processing. She did this. She collected information and held it for a moment before responding, which was a quality he recognized as his own and which he found both validating and faintly alarming. "Do you want to?" she'd asked. "Yeah, I do." "Does she?" "I don't know. That's why I'd be asking." Lily had nodded slowly, like this was a reasonable answer to a reasonable question. "What if she says no?" "Then she says no," he'd said. "And we figure out what comes next from there." "But you think she won't?" "I think—" He'd stopped, choosing carefully, because this was his daughter and she deserved the real version of things, not the smooth one. "I think we've built something real. I think she's in it the same way I am, and I think the only way to find out for sure is to ask." Lily had been quiet again. Then, "I like her." "I know." "She doesn't talk to me like I'm little." "I know." "She taught me that thing about load-bearing walls when we were watching that renovation show." She didn't have to do that. Wyatt had kept his eyes on the road and felt something in his chest that didn't have a precise name. "She pays attention to you," he'd said. "She does it because she wants to." Lily had put the adhesive hooks down and looked out the window at the street going past. "I haven't had that," she'd said, quietly, not with self-pity, just true. "Not like that. Not from someone who isn't you or Aunt Elena or Grandma." He hadn't said anything, because there wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. After a moment, Lily had said, "Ask her." And then, after another moment, "I want to be there." He'd looked at her. "At the dinner?" "Not at dinner. After. When you—" She'd made a vague gesture. "I want to be there." He'd thought about that. "Okay," he'd said. "If she says yes." Lily had nodded. "She'll say yes," she'd said, with the certainty of someone who had done an assessment and reached a conclusion. He'd almost said, "How do you know?" And then he'd thought about the fact that Lily had been watching Avery for a year with the same quiet, systematic attention she brought to everything. And she'd had a front row seat to something he was too close to see all of, and he'd decided to trust the analysis. He picked up the ring on a Wednesday during his lunch break from a jeweler on Clement that his mother had recommended with a specificity that suggested she'd been thinking about this longer than he had. It was not an elaborate ring. Avery was not an elaborate person. She wore one piece of jewelry consistently, a thin gold band on her right hand that she'd never explained and he'd never asked about. And he'd taken that as his signal, simple, well made, the kind of thing that didn't need to announce itself. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and drove back to the municipal building and sat through a 2-hour meeting about drainage infrastructure and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. That evening, Avery called from her car, the usual post-meeting call, and he sat on the back porch in the early dark and listened to her talk about a partnership negotiation that had gone sideways. And he made sounds at the right times and asked a question that was actually useful. And at some point she said, "You're quiet." And he said, "I'm listening." And she said, "You listen differently than most people." And he said, "How so?" And she said, "Like you're actually trying to understand, not just waiting for your turn." He thought about what she'd said for a long time after they hung up. Not because it was a compliment, though it was, but because of the implication underneath it. That she'd spent enough time around people who were waiting for their turn, that she'd learned to notice the difference. He thought about the year. Not in a catalog of events way, but in the way you thought about a thing that had changed you. Not suddenly, not all at once, but steadily, the way water changed stone. He thought about the woman in the restaurant who had clocked her own blind date setup in 30 seconds and held herself together with the dignity of someone who had been holding herself together for a long time before that. He thought about who she'd been in that first hour, defended in the specific way that people were defended when they'd been burned by the gap between how people performed acceptance and how they actually felt it, and who she was now, on the phone at 8 in the evening, not performing anything for him because she'd stopped needing to. He thought about Lily at the kitchen table, saying this is nice to no one in particular, and meaning it. He thought about what his mother had said, "You were better at being needed than at needing," and about how that had been true for longer than he'd wanted to admit, and about how Avery had, without trying and without making it a project, made it possible for that to change. He was not a man who cried easily or often. He was aware that was a fact about himself that was partly biology and partly the accumulated habit of years of holding things together alone. But sitting on the back porch in April, in the dark, with the city making its low ongoing sound in the distance, he felt the year in his chest in a way that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but was something that sat between them, in the place where gratitude lived when it was too large for its usual container. Friday came the way Fridays did, preceded by the week's full weight and arriving with the slightly disoriented quality of a day that had been anticipated long enough that the anticipation had become its own thing. He dropped Lily at his sister Elena's at 5:30. Elena met him at the door with the expression of someone who was very deliberately not saying things. "She told you," he said. "She told me nothing," Elena said. "She just asked if she could come over tonight and then stared at me until I said yes." He looked past Elena into the house, where Lily was already settled on the couch with Elena's oldest kid, looking for all the world like someone who had no particular stake in the evening's events. "She's a terrible liar," he said. "She didn't lie," Elena said. "She just presented selectively." "Also my fault." Elena put her hand on his arm briefly. "Go," she said. "Call me after." He picked Avery up at 7. She came out of her building in a black dress he hadn't seen before. Simple, not trying to be anything it wasn't. and her hair was back the way she'd worn it at the restaurant the first night, deliberately rather than rushed. She had her good coat over her arm, and she was looking at his face when she got in the car, and she said, "You're nervous?" "I'm not nervous." "You have the thing where your jaw is." "I'm not nervous." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Okay," she said, not convinced, just choosing, again, to trust the thing rather than manage it. They drove down Fifth, and when he turned into the parking structure and she saw the awning of Collier's through the windshield, she was quiet for a full 3 seconds. Then, "Wyatt?" "Yeah, this is the same restaurant." "I know." She looked at the building. He watched her face from the side. The particular way she processed things she hadn't expected, the quick sequence of recognition and feeling and containment, and then, sometimes, if she decided to let it, the thing underneath. She let it. "Okay," she said, quietly, and it carried about 4 different things at once. The hostess remembered them, or at least gave a professional impression of it that was warm enough to function as memory, and took them to a table near the window, which Wyatt had requested. Not the same table from that first night, but close enough to see the awning from outside. The restaurant was full in the Friday evening way, the low sound of other people's conversations filling the space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. They ordered, the truffle linguine for her, the steak for him. "Predictable," she said. "Strategic," he said. She smiled. The real one. They talked. The way they talked when there was no particular agenda, which was easily and without gaps, conversation moving between topics with the organic randomness of 2 people who had learned each other's patterns. She told him about a young woman on her engineering team who had submitted an idea for an adaptive interface feature, and the idea was genuinely brilliant, and Avery was trying to figure out how to develop her without making it feel like pressure. He talked about the county bridge, which had finally been resolved in his favor after a month of documentation and one very direct meeting where he'd shown the project manager photographs and not let him look away. "He finally listened," Avery said. "When I told him the repair would cost roughly 40% of what a lawsuit would." "You led with the money." "I led with the safety. Then I followed with the money when the safety wasn't working." She pointed at him with her fork. "That's actually good negotiating." "I've been learning from someone." She considered that. "I don't lead with safety." "No, you lead with the vision and then you back it up with the numbers." "Is that better?" He thought about it. "Different. Yours works for what you're building. Mine works for what I'm protecting." He looked at her. "We do different things." She looked back at him. "We're good at different things," she said, "and you've never made that a competition." He shook his head. "Why would I?" "You'd be surprised," she said, and said it without heat, just true, just the residue of years of being in rooms where her competence made people feel something that came out sideways. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm just not those people." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at her plate, and he saw her jaw move slightly the way it did when she was holding something that had more weight than she was showing. They were sitting with coffee and no particular hurry to leave when he said, "I want to tell you something." She looked up. "A year ago I came in that door over there." He tilted his head toward the entrance. "And I was annoyed at Marcus and tired, and I'd almost canceled twice, and I thought the whole evening was going to be another thing I'd gotten talked into and would regret." He held his cup in both hands. "And then I saw you, and the thing I felt wasn't what you might think. It wasn't attraction first, though that was there. The first thing I felt was anger on your behalf, because of what they were doing, because you were sitting there being watched, and you hadn't signed up for that." She was watching him quietly. "And then we talked," he said, "for 2.5 hours. And I drove home and I thought, I'd been existing inside my life for 3 years like a man who was just maintaining things, keeping everything running. And something had happened that night that I hadn't planned for, and for the first time in a long time, I thought about tomorrow." He set his cup down. "You changed that," he said. "Not by trying to. Just by being who you are. Exactly who you are, without performing any version of it." He paused. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like a speech, but the truth is I've been thinking about it for months, And this is just what it is. He reached into his jacket pocket. Avery saw the movement and her breath changed. Not dramatically, not in a movie way, just a slight catch, barely visible, the kind you only noticed if you'd learned what to watch for. He put the ring box on the table between them. "I'm not asking you to be anything different than what you are," he said. "I'm not asking you to slow down or simplify anything or make your life smaller. I'm asking if you want to share it, all of it. The company and the late calls and the logistics and the hard conversations and the things we're both still figuring out." He looked at her. "I'm asking if you want to do this with me and with Lily." The restaurant kept going around them. The low sound of voices, the small percussion of glasses and plates, the indifferent city noise from outside. None of it stopped for this moment, because life didn't stop, and he'd stopped expecting it to. Avery looked at the box. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were steady but not entirely dry, and she didn't seem embarrassed about that. "You're not doing a speech," she said quietly. "I told you I wasn't." "You're just—" She stopped. "You're just saying it." "Yeah." She looked at the box again. He opened it. The ring sat there, simple and plain and exactly right, and he waited. She was quiet for what felt like a long time and was probably 15 seconds. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "When I came out of the accident," she said slowly, like she was choosing the words one at a time. "Not right after, but in the second year, when I was building the company and learning what my life was going to look like, I made a decision, not out loud, just privately. I decided I wasn't going to need anyone in a way that could be taken advantage of." She looked at her hands on the table. "I decided being enough for myself was the only guarantee I had. And for a long time that was true. It kept me functional and it kept me moving forward, and I don't regret it because it got me to where I am." She looked at him. "And then you came in that door and crouched down so you weren't looming and introduced yourself. And you moved us to a different table, and you spent 2.5 hours actually listening, and you drove me home and texted me about the truffle linguine, and I thought—" She stopped again, and the jaw muscle moved. "I thought, he's going to be a problem for the decision I made." His mouth moved before he could stop it. "I've been waiting for you to be like the others," she said, not consciously. "But somewhere underneath I've been waiting for the performance to end and the real version to show up. The impatience or the pity or the competitiveness or whatever particular shape the disappointment was going to take." She looked at the ring. "You just never were." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want to do this with you." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. "And yes," she said, after a moment, "with Lily. Especially with Lily." He thought about his daughter on the couch at Elena's house, waiting, carrying her secret with the gravity of someone who had decided to trust the outcome. He thought about her saying she's good, half asleep with a fever breaking, and "I want to be there," in the car with the adhesive hooks in her lap. He thought about what it meant that a 7-year-old who'd been observing everything had reached the same conclusion he had. He took the ring from the box and put it on her hand, and she looked at it for a moment. Not at the object, he thought, but at what it represented, the decision it named, the year that had led to this table. "It fits," she said. "I asked your assistant for your ring size." She looked at him. "You asked Lydia." She was very discreet about it. "She didn't tell me." "I know, I was impressed." Avery shook her head slowly, not in frustration but in something that was close to wonder. "You planned this?" "A little." "You're not usually a planner." "I was motivated." She looked at him with that look, the open one, the one she didn't always mean to show. And then she laughed, quietly, the real kind, and he thought he would remember the sound of it for the rest of his life. He called Elena from the parking structure while Avery was getting her coat. "Well?" Elena said before he could say anything. She said yes. A pause. Then Elena made a sound that was not quite a word and was entirely recognizable, and he heard behind her Lily's voice. Did she say yes? And Elena saying, "Yeah, Bug." And Lily, who was 7 and had been carrying this for 3 weeks and had decided with the certainty of someone who had done the analysis, said, "I know." He heard Elena laugh. He put his phone in his pocket and walked back to the entrance of the parking structure where Avery was waiting, her coat on, the ring on her hand, looking at the street with an expression he hadn't quite seen on her before. Not the controlled one, not the assessing one. Just present. Just there. In her own life. Without the weight of the distance she'd kept between herself and what she wanted. "Lily wants to see you," he said. Avery looked at him. "She's been waiting. She knew I was going to ask tonight." He paused. "She wanted to be there, after." Avery's expression shifted through something he couldn't fully name. Recognition, maybe, or the particular feeling of being seen by someone who had no reason to perform it. "She knew?" Avery said. 3 weeks?" She didn't say anything. "I know." He held out his hand. "She wanted to be the first person you saw after." Avery looked at his hand, and then she took it, and they walked out from under the parking structure awning into the open air of the street, where the city was doing what it always did, indifferent and loud and proceeding without reference to the small, significant moments happening inside it. And the night was cool and clear, and the lights of Fifth Street made the wet pavement glow the way it had 1 year ago. He thought about what he'd learned in the year, not from books or from bridges, but from the slower and more humbling education of loving someone who made it necessary to be honest. He'd learned that the thing most people called strength, the self-sufficiency, the keeping it together, the never letting on, was not the same thing as being okay. That you could run well on your own for years and still be running away from something. And the difference between maintenance and living was whether there was someone you were choosing to move toward. He'd learned that the right person didn't complete you in the way that phrase was usually meant. She didn't fill the gaps or sand down the rough edges or make the hard parts disappear. She just made it possible to look at the hard parts without looking away. She made it possible to say, "This is what I actually am," and not have that be a liability. He'd learned that Lily, who was 7 and read people the way he read structures, had understood this before he'd said it out loud, and had done him the particular kindness of telling him to move forward before his caution could become a permanent state. He thought about standing beside someone rather than in front of them. About the year of watching Avery handle the things that were hers to handle and being nearby without stepping in front, and about how much harder that was than it sounded, and how much more it meant. Rescue was easy, presence was not. Showing up, again and again, not to fix things, but to be there while they were being worked through. That was the thing nobody gave enough credit to. He thought about a woman in a wheelchair who had walked into a restaurant knowing she was being watched, and had held herself together without making it a performance, and had told him in the first 10 minutes that she didn't want sympathy and had meant it, and who had spent a year quietly dismantling the very reasonable defenses she'd built, and handing him the pieces not because he'd asked, but because she'd decided he was safe to trust with them. He thought about that being the bravest thing he'd ever witnessed. They drove to Elena's with the radio low and their hands occupying the space between the seats, and Lily met them at the door with the specific, barely contained energy of someone who had been sitting very still for several hours, and was now done sitting still. She looked at Avery's hand. Then she looked at Avery's face. Then she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone whose analysis had been confirmed, "I knew you'd say yes." Avery looked at her for a moment, at this 7-year-old who paid attention and told the truth, and had been, in the quiet and systematic way of children who learned young to observe, watching for a year to see if this was real. "Did you?" Avery said. "You look at my dad like you're keeping track of him," Lily said. "People don't do that unless they want to keep them." Elena, in the doorway behind Lily, pressed her lips together. Avery was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "That's very accurate." "I know." Lily stepped forward and put her arms around Avery. Not tentatively, not the careful hug of someone checking if it was allowed, but fully, the way she hugged people she'd decided were hers. And Avery's hand came up to the back of her head and held her there, and neither of them said anything. Wyatt stood on the porch in the April night and looked at the two of them and thought about what it cost to stay open to things after life had given you good reasons to close. He thought about how his daughter had learned at 7 some version of what he'd only started learning at 32. He thought about the fact that 3 people who had each spent time being more alone than they needed to be had found their way to this porch on this night, and that none of it had been smooth or inevitable, It had been chosen repeatedly through doubt and fear and the specific ordinary courage of deciding not to stop. That was the thing about love, he thought, not the version that arrived fully formed and asked nothing of you, but the real kind, the kind you built. It required you to keep deciding, not once, not twice, but every day, in the small moments and the large ones, in the disagreements and the late-night calls and the fevers, and the birthday parties, and the long silences in kitchens. You kept deciding, and the deciding was the thing. The deciding was what made it real. He thought he was still learning how to do it. He thought that was fine. He stepped forward and put his arms around both of them, his daughter and the woman she'd just decided to claim. And the three of them stood on Elena's porch in the cooling air of an April night, held together by a year of ordinary moments that had turned out, in the adding up, to be extraordinary. Not because they were perfect, because they were true. Yeah. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep in Elena's guest room, too excited to go home, not wanting the night to end, Wyatt and Avery sat on Elena's back porch with 2 cups of tea. Neither of them was really drinking, the yard quiet and dark, the neighborhood sounds low and distant. Avery had her coat over her shoulders and was looking at the ring in the porch light, not obsessively, just occasionally, the way you looked at a thing that was new enough to still surprise you. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I've thought sometimes about the accident," she said it carefully, "about what it cost, what it changed." She looked at her hand. "I spent a long time thinking of it as a before and an after. Like the person I was before was the real version, and everything after was what I was left with." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't think that anymore." He didn't fill the silence. "The person I was before wouldn't have built the company," she said. "Wouldn't have known how. Wouldn't have known what was worth building." She paused. "Wouldn't have walked into that restaurant and known within 30 seconds what was happening and held herself together anyway." She looked at him. "I don't know who I'd be now if the accident hadn't happened, but I don't think she'd be sitting here. I don't think she'd have known what this was worth." He thought about everything she'd carried, about the husband who had left slowly when the wait became inconvenient, about the years of building something alone, not because she'd wanted to, but because it had been necessary and she'd been capable. And those 2 things had fused into a personality that was simultaneously her greatest strength and her loneliest quality. "You were already who you needed to be," he said. "The accident just made it visible." She looked at him. "You said it yourself," he said. "The things that survived, the decisions, the clarity, the way you know what you're worth, those weren't new. They were already in you. The hard thing just proved it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That's a very civil engineer way to talk about a person." "You were the one who said load-bearing walls were interesting." She almost smiled. "I did say that." "You were right." She set her cup down on the armrest of her chair. She looked at the dark yard. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "I'm glad you came in that door," she said. "I almost didn't." "I know. Marcus told me, eventually." A pause. "I'm glad you did anyway." He thought about the man who had been sitting in the parking structure with the engine idling, adding up his reasons to turn around. He thought about how easily that version of the night could have been the real one. How close it had been. How much had depended on a 7-year-old saying you should go and a man deciding for once not to protect himself from the possibility of something. "Me too," he said. The yard was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and stopped. The city's low sound continued, indifferent as ever, carrying inside it the 10,000 small decisions and accidents and refusals and surrenders that made up the lives of people who had no idea they were inside a story anyone would want to tell. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. That was everything. That was, in the end, all of it. 2 people in the dark, on an ordinary night in April, holding on.